Hello everyone and welcome to PC Retro Tech. In this week's video, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the latest acquisition of the channel, a Compaq Desk Pro 386s. Now, I probably sound a little bit excited about this, and I am. There's a little bit of a story behind this. So when I first saw one of these machines on an online auction website, I thought to myself, wow, what a beautiful design. It just exudes that late 80s design aesthetic. And I thought to myself, this is going to go for quite a sum, so I'll have to bid fairly high. So I took the highest value that I thought it would go for and added considerably more. There wasn't really any risk in bidding high. If it went low, I would still get it for a low price. But little did I know there would be a bidding frenzy on this thing, and quite a lot of people bid it up, and it went for a fortune. Now, I knew that it wasn't going to come up again. This was a one-off, and that's why people had bid so furiously on this machine. So it was a shame to miss out on. Now, I'm not a particularly materialistic guy, but I do admit that over the past couple of years, I have regretted missing out on that particular auction. So what I've done here is, it's now 3 years later, is acquire all of the parts for a complete system. So I got them really from all over the world, the US, the UK and Germany. And I think I have everything matched up correctly. You can see that the Compaq livery on this thing is with a yellow to red gradient, and the same on the keyboard and the main system unit. The mouse is branded differently, but I think it's still the same era, and I can't see any mice anywhere that are branded in the same way by Compaq. So I do think this is roughly the correct era for the mouse. Now, one thing that stands out that doesn't match is the 5¼ inch floppy drive in the middle there. Now, that is a little bit of a different color, and obviously it has been added aftermarket. It is a Compaq one. But I will try to find one that matches the color of the machine eventually. Now, unfortunately, there is one other issue that I already know about, and that is because when I got the monitor, I plugged it into another computer to test it, and there was some buzzing, very awful looking yellowy picture, a lot of flickering, and about 8 seconds later, there was a very loud crack and a lot of smoke started pouring out of it. So the first order of business today is to repair that monitor so we can try it all out. The system unit itself, the seller told me to expect anything. There could be bits missing, there could be broken parts, there could be damage that's not in the description. At least he was very honest about that, so I don't know what to expect there, whether it will even work. But we'll find that out, but first let's get that monitor working. So I finally got into this monitor, and this is not something you should try to do yourself. You will certainly need specialized tools and equipment that are very hard to come by. In particular, the back of this particular monitor is actually glued to the RF shield, and these black connection points here were screwed into the PCB from the top of the PCB, and of course the top of the PCB is not in any way accessible until you get the back off. Well, something like that anyway. Congratulations to the brilliant designer who came up with this. In any event, you should never try to repair a CRT yourself unless you have electronics experience and know exactly what you're doing. I have experience, and I consulted a professional repairer so that I knew how to properly discharge the device, since they can carry a very, very powerful charge. Despite what other YouTubers say, it is not safe to work on these things, whether they're switched on or off, unless you know what you're doing. The problem with this particular monitor was easy to find. It's this component here, which you can see is all blown out in the sides, and a lot of it is now actually splattered over the components nearby. So we'll take that out. It's almost certainly what was causing all of the smoke, unless something else more expensive blew up to protect the fuse, I suppose. But it's just a simple desoldering job now that we have access to the back of the PCB, and once we replace that, chances are this monitor will start working again. While reviewing the footage, I discovered that the capacitor that's right next to the component that we want to take out, it's a little bit hard to tell what it is until it's out because it's so badly damaged, but that capacitor is also split and probably on its way out if it isn't already dead. So I'm going to remove that as well. I think my desoldering gun is probably just about up to temperature here. So let's just desolder that. Now that those two components are out, it's actually pretty easy to see that they're the same thing, and after some searching I had discovered the bit that had blown off the top of the one that was most obviously blown up, and it actually also says exactly the same thing on it. It's a 250 volt 4700 picofarad capacitor. So I just need to order a couple of those and wait for them to turn up, and with any luck this will power up again. Well, that didn't take long. Actually, it's a couple of days later, but it's turned up very late in the day that I want to do filming, but let's have a look at what these look like. So these are quite large compared to the other ones. These are Vima brand, assuming it's German, and they're 4700 picofarad. They're actually 1600 volts. Much higher voltage than the original ones, so I guess they're not going to pop at all. They look pretty robust. So let's stick a couple of these in to replace the original capacitors and see if the monitor powers up. Well, it wasn't at all easy to poke those through the board, and actually there isn't enough room for both of them to sit next to each other here, so one of them has to sit a little higher over a nearby component. But I think that we can now solder this in, and hopefully that'll be an easy job. And there's just the 4 leads to solder up here. It looks like they're soldering in okay. This is a pretty crude soldering job. It doesn't matter too much because it's such a large area to solder. So this is the 4th one here, I believe. We just need to make sure that there's actual contact of the solder with the leads, and that should be all that's required. Well, that took far too long to get back together, of course, and it probably helped that I had all the screws labelled where they came from, but I was quite puzzled for a while. I had 2 screws that said bottom, and I didn't realise you have to have the cover off before you can see the particular part of the bottom plastic that they screw into. But anyway, it's back together. So the acid test is whether I can switch this on without magic smoke coming out. I've not plugged it into a computer at the moment. I'm just plugging it into the mains, and I'm just going to switch the switch and see what happens. So either there'll be a big bang and a lot of smoke, or it'll not do anything particularly exciting. Well, there are encouraging sounds coming out of it. I can certainly hear the high voltage, and there's some kind of flickering on the screen, so this doesn't look too bad. Of course, we might have knocked some of the coils, but let's plug it into a computer now and see whether we get an image. So I have it plugged into my 286 now, just with a simple VGA card in there, and let's switch it back on again. That seems to be going still. Let's power on the computer and see whether we get any kind of image. And will you look at that? It's working. Fantastic. Okay, so we have a working Compaq monitor. Now I need to run something with some color to see whether that's all working correctly, but given that we've got a nice white there, I think it's very likely. I apologize for the flicker here, that's just my camera of course, but what I'm going to do is load a picture, and I have one here. It's the PC Retrotech gecko that I drew, and let's just move him up so we can see him a little bit better. So I think the image here looks really clear. There is a little bit of bowing in at the side of the monitor on both sides, but apart from that, everything looks crystal clear and definitely usable. So this is great. Now let's hook it up to the actual Compaq 386 itself and see what actually happens when we switch that on. So I'm just going to switch on the monitor, and the main system unit. Now it doesn't have a hard drive in it. I've already had it open just to have a brief look. So of course I've got a MS-DOS 6.22 floppy in there. So it does seem to be working. We're getting 2048 kilobytes of memory, which is not a huge amount, but it's now asking for a diagnostic diskette in drive A, which I'm not going to give it because I don't have one. But let's run an MS-DOS disk and see whether it actually boots. So yeah, it looks like it's working perfectly. So that's great news. It looks like we have a functioning 386. So let's see if the keyboard works. It does, sort of. And yeah, it looks like the floppy itself is also functioning, which is good news because it means that we're not going to have too much trouble getting this thing to work. So the first thing I'm going to do is open this up, of course, and have a look and see whether there's somewhere I can connect a hard drive to it. And then I think I'll install MS-DOS 6.22 and probably Windows 3.1 as a first step, just to testing the machine out and making sure it does what it's supposed to do. This is the back of the machine, which I've got propped up so you can see it. It's got a key in the back with a label that says Fort Lock Corp, which presumably made the lock and key system. It says key ID 265, which is fun. So there is a dual voltage system, so it'll take 120 or 220 or 240 volts. And you can see that it has a PS2 keyboard and mouse connector, a printer port, a serial port, again presumably for a mouse or just serial connection. And here we have a VGA monitor port. Now there's 4 expansion bays. They're actually numbered up the top there, 4, 3, 2, 1. And that's basically all there is to the back. To get the back off, all that I need to do is undo the screws. There are 3 of those around here. They're just thumb screws, so nice and easy to get into. So let's take a look inside. Well, we're in, and it looks very neat inside, and the immediate good news is that there is a connector here that looks like an IDE connector for a hard drive, which has presumably been removed. It does look like there was some kind of bracket here that held that in, which is missing. So I don't know whether I can get one of those and install that, but at least for the time being we can insert a hard drive and just leave it hanging, and that should work. There is a Molex connector for a drive. This is obviously the power supply here, and you can see the back of the floppy drives and the tape drive down the bottom there. There is some kind of daughter board here. I don't know whether the CPU is on that. There is actually a empty socket here, and presumably that's for a 387 coprocessor. Actually, this is probably the 386 here on the main board. It says Intel on it. So other than that, there's not very much I can see just at the moment. So I'm going to take the daughter board out and have a little bit of a closer look at that. And I'll have a bit of a poke around some of these chips here and see what's inside. Well, it turns out there's a helpful diagram on the side here, and it tells me that this board is actually 16 megahertz expansion board, and that you can plug modules into it. So obviously I don't have any of the modules to plug in, but maybe that allows you to upgrade the RAM even further. There's nothing here labelled battery, but then again the IDE ports, which are presumably here, are also not labelled. So I'm going to take it apart anyway just to check and make sure, and also because I want to have a sticky beak and see what's inside. Got a slightly better view of the CPU here. I'm not sure how readable that will be on film. It's barely readable in real life. But on the top line there it says 386SX16. So it is a 386, which is good news. And it runs at 16 megahertz. What I'm not seeing in the machine at all is battery. And I've looked around in here where all the accessible parts are, and didn't find it, but I'm also not expecting it to be accessible. To get the daughter board out, it's not just a screw. No, that would be too easy. You have to have a special tool to get this out. And in fact, that's the same for all of the expansion cards in this. So what I'm going to have to do, I think, is take out the floppy drives and have a hunt around for a battery. If that's leaked, or if there isn't a battery at all, those are both things I would like to know about. So I have taken the daughter board or expansion board, I'm not exactly sure what to call it, out of the machine, and just have a look at it. There are 4 connectors here that look for all the world like IDE connectors, but I'm not going to draw that conclusion. They could also just be connectors for another board to slot in on top here. So it looks to me like this is a RAM expansion board because these look like RAM chips. So presumably the 2 megabytes of memory is actually on here. Either that or it's just not configured correctly to use whatever this is. It is a little bit of a surprise to me in the 286 era to have so many chips for 2 megabytes of RAM. Anyway, let's get the floppies out and see if we can figure out if there's a battery and if it's leaked. I have the floppy assembly lifted up here. There are just 4 screws at the front that come out. And underneath, what do you know, there's a battery completely inaccessible, almost as predicted. This is a Dallas chip which has a battery inside it, presumably. But this is actually a socketed one, so it looks like that should be removable and replaceable, which is good news. There's no sign of leakage, and you wouldn't expect that anyway. Presumably in this can here, there's actually a cover missing off it. This is the VGA, no doubt, but it seems to be Compaq's own rendition of this. The chip just says Compaq on it. There's a lot of other chips in here that I don't know what they do, some kind of chipset. I guess there's a hard drive controller and a floppy controller and who knows what else in there. Some of these chips here must surely be memory for the VGA unless it's shared with the system memory. I'm not really sure about that. I don't think that would be likely. There are connectors for the Molex going to the floppy and hard drive, the black connectors at the back there, and a white connector for the motherboard from the power supply. And you can see a floppy connector and the IDE connector for the hard drive seems to be plugged in at the moment at the back. That's the most inaccessible thing you can see there. So everything looks in order, and I think this is safe to use without too much panic. I assume that this chip with the white label on it is the BIOS, although that remains to be confirmed. But anyway, let's put it all back together, and I think I'm going to install a hard drive and try to get into the BIOS somehow and see whether I can actually set it up to run with a hard drive. Well, what do you know, there's a switch settings label on the top here which I just hadn't noticed before. It doesn't say a lot about the fixed disk drive. There's one here that says diskette fixed disk drive, select secondary drive or primary drive address. And there is a fixed disk drive controller, enable or disable, so I will set that to enable and put a hard drive in and see what happens. As for the memory, I had a look at the chips on that expansion board, and they are KM41C 256-P chips, and the 256 tells us they're 256 kilobits. There's 24 of them, so if you do the calculation, there's actually only 768 kilobytes of memory on that expansion board, which is way less than I would have thought. So it says that there's 640 kilobytes on the base memory and 1 megabyte on the system board in total, and so this is almost certainly a 2 megabyte machine, which is very low for the 386 era, but I guess if you had an office and you just needed to do some basic stuff and back up to tape, that's all you really needed. So it would be nice to upgrade this at some point. You can see that this is for a memory expansion board of 1 megabyte, and you can get up to 4 megabyte modules to attach to that board to bring you up to a total of 13 megabytes, assuming you have a 4 megabyte expansion board, which I don't. So it looks like the most that I'll be able to go with the 1 megabyte expansion board is just 10, but that would be plenty, of course. Whether those modules are available anywhere or not, I just don't know at this point. So for now, I'm just going to put a hard drive in and see what happens. Now it turns out that I have another 386 Compaq machine. It's definitely not in working order. The power supply is completely shot. and there's lots of bits missing from it as well. It's also badly damaged, but it does have a hard drive in it, and so what I'm going to do is take this and try it in the other machine and see whether it'll recognize it. I think it has a greater chance, given that Compaq actually used these in 386s. So it says it's a CP30061G. So let's try it out and see whether or not that does anything. So apparently to get into any BIOS settings or change any BIOS settings, you need to run the diagnostic diskette that it talks about, and there's a file that you have to download, sp0308.exe, and when you run it off a disk in the machine, then this is what comes up, and it offers to create a diskette for you. So I'm going to do that and see if I can get the hard drive to work in the machine. Well, I've been having a few problems trying to get the program to run that gets into the BIOS, and basically what happens when you run the program is it reads just fine, but once it tries to write to the floppy disk, it says sector not found. So what I'm going to do is switch over to the floppy disk from the other machine, which is the same. It has a proprietary connector on the back here, which is weird. Either that or this is just what 720K connectors look like at first. But there is an adapter board in the machine itself, which goes to a normal floppy connector, so we'll be able to connect it up no problems, and I'll see if that enables me to actually write to a disk. Well, I finally seem to have got into the Compaq setup utility. I've been going around in circles for really hours now. So it turns out the floppy drive wasn't faulty. Well, at least if you put the floppy in a couple of times, it'll eventually read the floppy disk. And I have the same problem with both drives actually. They just seem to be an unreliable mechanism that sometimes doesn't recognize that there's really a floppy in there. But the real problem was the software, which is called SoftPak, and this is available to this day on the HP Compaq website, and there are two versions of it. There is SP0308 and SP0316, and they're basically 500 kilobyte files that want to create another 500 kilobyte file on a 720 kilobyte floppy disk. I mean, these machines have 720K floppies in them, so this is another example of brilliant engineering which makes it impossible to use the product. But anyway, I assume that those are actually meant to be run either over a network or on a hard drive, but of course I'm trying to set up a hard drive here and don't have a network. So at any rate, I found a way around this. Somebody has actually pre-extracted these files and made them available on archive.org. So I've downloaded the extracted version of this and put it on a floppy disk, which seems to be a bootable floppy. It's a floppy image, and once you get around the fact that you can't format disks in Windows 7 anymore, and neither can any program format the disks, if you can find a program that will, extract an image and make it a bootable disk, which is also a bit of a problem, you can actually get into the Compaq setup utility. So there's a few things on this disk. There's apparently a test program and various other things as well. But what I want to do is run this one. So now it says, have you run this program since connecting the battery? I don't know what that means, so I'm just going to put yes. And it says it says I now need to see a Compaq dealer. Well, it's going to let me go through, but apparently the battery in this thing is flat. I've had a look. It might be possible to get a battery for this. So I'm not going to bother putting in a date or a time here because it's not really that important. If this works, then that's more important. So the drive is a 720 kilobyte drive as far as I'm able to see. I suppose I could try the 1.44 option and see what happens, but initial power on state for the numlock key, I don't know whether that's asking me what I want it to be or what it is. It is on when I turn the machine on, so I'm just going to select on. And now we seem to be into some BIOS settings. Interestingly enough, it seems to have detected the hard drive, which is a Type 55. I've got the drive from the other Compaq machine in here, 60 megabytes. That's a nice size. So this looks like it should be okay. So I don't know what's going to happen when I press exit here. F3 is exit and save changes. Let's just see what happens when the machine boots, whether it detects that hard drive. So it does reboot. Unfortunately, it doesn't require me to power the machine down because, of course, the settings will be lost if I do that. So it's not complaining. It's still saying to insert the diagnostic disk, which I'm actually going to take out because I don't want to boot from that. Let's just see what happens if I press the resume key, which is F1. It's booting. It's booting from the hard drive. Fantastic. Okay, so we have a hard drive that works, which is amazing. And yeah, it looks like there's all sorts of stuff on here. There's Xtree Gold, DOS. It looks like Windows is on here. Actually, let's just see if we can go into Windows. Maybe it's already installed. So it looks like Windows is on here, which is fantastic. And in German, not enough memory. Okay, that's not a surprise. So with 2 megs of memory, you're probably not going to get into Windows, at least not very easily, with a lot of screwing around. But at least the machine is working now. So let's put some things on here that are fun to try out. So of course, I don't have very much time left this weekend to do filming, since I actually have visitors arriving soon. So what I'm going to do is put some old assembly demos on and see what they look like. The first demo here is called My Spies, and I'm going to have the same problem with most of these, and that is that I don't have a sound card installed in this. Bear in mind that there's no CD-ROM drive in this machine, so it's not that easy to get stuff on here. In particular, I'm limited to demos that will fit on a single floppy disk, or at least that I can get across in floppy disks. So here's the first one that I found. It's really just something random from 1994 or before, which should run on a 386. And yeah, it looks pretty good actually. So there is a story, probably apocryphal, that Microsoft engineers used these machines because they were so fast in the day. I'm not totally blown away by the performance of the thing. I mean, it's just a 16 megahertz 386, and obviously with so little memory, there's really nothing that special about them. The second demo I found is called Timeless, and again I'm going to have to select no sound. This is basically what I would call a one effect demo. It's some kind of lens on some background that's changing. So it gets a little bit boring after a while, so I'm not going to let this run for very long. It does actually get a little bit more sophisticated as it goes. There's some animation that comes up over the top of the demo, but otherwise it's really just the same effect presented in different ways. So very, very clever, and I would say the frame rate, it's probably very hard to judge from the film because of the camera and the flicker. But I think the frame rate is something like 20 frames a second, maybe actually a little bit higher than that. So it's quite a nice effect and done very well. What I notice about a lot of demos from this era is they're still using fairly primitive techniques compared to what we have nowadays. And it's not really surprising that when Second Reality came along by Future Crew, it really transformed the PC scene, because up to that point a lot of PC demos, and bear in mind I'm showing some of the good ones here, were actually quite primitive compared to what's possible on the machines. Anyway, this is about as much of this as I'm going to show. You can of course download it yourself if you want to see more of it. The final demo I'm going to show is called No Lamers Allowed, and it asks whether I have a 286 or faster, because this is a very early demo from about 1991 I think, and it's also early in style in that it's based around text and a text scroller. This warning is a joke, by the way. It's nothing in the demo that's unsuitable. And so basically it has impressive text scroller and some very basic demo effects, which is what you would expect from this time. However, I should point out that Future Crew were already making demos and were already winning competitions around about this point, or certainly at least by the next year, and they were very good. So of course I've been showing you the best demos I can find, but I'm also limited to the ones that will actually run on the machine. Very often they just say that the file is not executable, or the zip file is corrupted, or it just won't run on this machine because it was timed to run on a very specific piece of hardware. And the biggest problem I have, of course, is getting the files across. If there's an individual file that's bigger than 720k, then I can't put it on the machine, and that's the case for a lot of demos. So the larger demos I haven't seen yet on this machine. This is actually a particularly small demo, but it is quite good in terms of you know, what they've actually managed to achieve, even if it is only a one effect demo. So I hope that you've enjoyed this look at the Compaq 386s. It's a beautiful old machine, and I really think it captures the aesthetic of the era perfectly. It'll definitely feature on the channel again. So if you enjoyed seeing this and you want to see more of this sort of thing, don't forget to like and subscribe. In the future, I hope to do some coding on this machine, and I'm going to take the 2 megabyte limit as just an inherent limit that is something that I have to live with. It doesn't look like it's going to be possible to buy upgrade units. They were probably thousands of dollars when they were new, and so they're very rare. It's not going to come up in all likelihood, at least not in the next few years, and if it does, it'll be very, very expensive. So I think the objective will be to work with the limits that the machine actually has and push those to the limit and see what's possible with VGA and 2 megabytes of memory with a 16 megahertz 386. So you want to see more of that sort of stuff, like and subscribe. That's all I have for you this week. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you in a later video. Bye.